So let's talk a little bit here about the different printers that we can use for implantology. So we talked before about the difference between something that's about 100 microns in the XY and the higher resolution printers. And we need that if we're going to print implant analog models or print hybrids. So there's a number of different brands of printers out there with tons of different prices. If you want to kind of be balling on a budget, a lot of people have tried the Frozen Sonic Mini, which is $350. It has an XY resolution of 47 microns. So you don't have to spend a lot of money. If you guys know me, I test a lot of these printers. The Asiga, the Sprint Ray, and now the Einstein from Desktop Health are all 3 printers that I own, and they're all excellent. The key thing is you want an XY resolution of under 70 microns. Just a quick side note, I had mentioned these color models before, but this has really got me excited for the future. So to 3D print a hybrid, you typically print in one color, right? So V to A1, V to A2 with Onyx resin or Flexera or Bagos material, Verseo Crown. And then you have to layer the tissue with stains and sort of characterize the teeth as well. So these are 3D printed models from the Stratasys system. They are actively working on a color 3D printed denture system and a hybrid system where all we would have to do is glaze it, right? Paint on some clear glaze and we're good to go. So I think this is really the future of where printing is going. So you may ask yourself, well, I've got a Sprint Ray Pro 95. Why do I need a more accurate printer for hybrids? All boils down to the amount of spacer between an analog or a multi-unit in a hybrid. So in exocad, and I'm not familiar with 3Shape, the maximum spacer that you can have is 75 microns. And so if you have a printer that can't resolve down to 75 microns, you're going to have things that don't fit. So you can sort of play with the scale, I guess, with a 95 printer, but I'd rather not. So if you find that you are an office that's doing a lot of hybrids, you're going to want a printer that can print in the XY less than 70 microns. So one thing that I've changed my tune on when it comes to hybrids is direct to multi-unit. So in previous lectures, we've talked about tie bases, and I'll talk about tie bases again. But a tie base is a metal part that gets cemented into the hybrid so that it can cover and retain the screw of the multi-unit. That introduces error, for one. So if you don't glue in the tie bases right in your hybrid, you'll have a hybrid that doesn't fit. But it also increases cost. So each multi-unit tie base is between 50 to 80 bucks, depending on the system. So you're spending about $500, $600 per arch just on tie bases. And so if I'm 3D printing a prototype hybrid and the patient doesn't like it, then I've got to spend another $500 or $600 on another 3D printed hybrid. Whereas if I did it without tie bases, so direct to multi-unit, then it would only cost me the cost of the resin. So I really like a type of screw called the Rosen screw. This was invented by Dr. Dan Rosen, who's just up the street from me. And in exocad and 3Shape, the screw channel is designed so that this screw engages the 3D printed resin and the zirconia, if you go and use these with zirconia, and it just needs to be hand tightened. And so it's not meant to be torqued down. So it's a pretty amazing system. These screws are cheap. These are about $9 each, and it's just a great way to go. So let's talk a little bit about materials, and let's go back in time. So let's go back about 20 years. And 20 years ago, when we wanted an all-ceramic restoration, we stacked porcelain. And this multi-layered stacked restoration had a flexural strength of about 90 to 140 megapascals. So all ceramic crowns were not indicated on molars because they just weren't strong enough. So over time, Emax was introduced, so milled lithium disilicate, and now zirconia. And we have these monolithic materials that are between 360 and 900 megapascals. And that has basically become our go-to materials for crowns. But now we've got a wave of 3D printed materials coming out. Onyx resin from Sprint Ray, Flexera from Desktop Health, Varseo Crown from Bago, that are saying that they can be used as permanent restorations. They have flexural strength of about 147 megapascals, comparable to our stacked ceramic. So the rationale is, well, these are just as strong as stacked ceramic, so they can be used as a final material. And I don't buy that, because we're used to having very high strength monolithic materials, and by definition, a 3D printed restoration is a stacked restoration. So we're going back in time when it comes to strength. So I think these 3D printed hybrid materials are great for temporaries. They have strength pretty comparable to PMMA. However, I would not, in my mouth, want to have a printed restoration that only has the strength of a stacked porcelain. But there's lots out there, and so depending on the printer system you have, you would pick these different materials. And you can see that they can be made to look very nice. So I feel that 3D printed hybrids are great for that temporary stage where you're trying to work out the bite, the midline, the gingival display. But once the patient approves it, don't leave them in for too long. I don't really have any printed hybrids out there over 3 or 4 months old. They do tend to get kind of brittle. So I would have a patient wear it for about a month and see how they like it. And if they like it, then use that same STL to go to your final prosthesis. So this is a case where we used 3D printed hybrids to work out some aesthetic problems. And so in this case here, I used the EnvisionTech 1 using sort of a precursor to their Flexera material called E-Crown. And so we had a patient that was a bit of a challenge because his occlusal plane is canted, his facial midline doesn't match his maxillary anterior midline, and his lower midline doesn't match the top of that either. So we scanned the patient. This was back in the day before we found photogrammetry, and we took a face scan on the patient. We printed out the hybrids. In this case, I don't use this product anymore, but I did, called Annex Gum from Annex Dent. So now I use the OptiGlaze system, but it all works pretty much the same way. There's different tints and stains and composites that you can add to the gingiva. And so the lab was able to put together the patient's teeth with the patient's face scan to figure out a midline. And we ended up, printing these. We printed these in 2 pieces, actually, the base in pink and the teeth. And one thing that was really cool is we were playing around with EnvisionTech's printing software, and they figured out a way to make the incisal edges translucent. So we got sort of an incisal translucency. So this is it in the patient's mouth, but basically the patient's buccal corridors are very narrow, and the patient didn't like that. So when I do temporaries, I like to use Instagums in the screw hole. No Teflon tape, no cotton, no composite. You just fill up the entire screw hole with this polyvinyl material. And so patient went away, lab redesigned the case showing more teeth, and you can see here that we now have a better buccal corridor. And if you look over here, you can see the difference between the two. We can see here that we now have a built-out buccal corridor, and we can make these changes in the temporary. They call them prototypes not to be fancy, but because the same STL that the patient approves is the same STL the zirconia is made of, that gives us the ability to make changes before we get to the final. So just a quick thing about the designs. I mentioned this in the last lecture, so I'm not going to go through this whole slide. But really, the two best designers I know for hybrids are either Daniel Portal, who's based in the US, or Jacob Farber, who's based in Eastern Europe. These guys charge about $300 US, but they do an amazing job. And depending on which time zone you're in, they can even be on call for you. So if you wanted to do a same-day conversion, you could. So Jacob did this case, and Jacob was really an interesting guy. He was a dentist in the US, trained in the Pankey Institute. And if you guys are familiar with the Pankey Institute, they're very big on occlusion. And he's also a really thinking out of the box kind of guy. So this patient came in. Sometimes at the homeless shelter, we wouldn't have all the parts we'd want. So she's got one implant in the midline, and it is sticking straight out. And so we didn't have any angled multi-units. So we ended up just putting a straight multi-unit, and Jacob took it from there. So what he did was he designed the hybrid with a little crown prep and a tooth. And so rather than having the screw hole coming through the facial, we screwed it in, and you can see in the next image how the final looked. And so we were able to just screw that in. We cemented the tie bases in. This was actually cemented outside the mouth. And you can see where that crown covers up that tooth. And on the left, you see the PMMAs, and on the right, you see the zirconia. So the same situation. So kind of a smart way to go.